Rellana's Twin Blade is one of the latest versatile weapons out there, and this weapon almost adapts to any situations because it's unique kit and can be a fun playstyle to many. In this video, I'll be guiding you on how to maximize the usage of this weapon and even state some of the underlying issues that this weapon has and help you overcome them in the process. I'm the Samurai and I'll be covering the Moonblaze Samurai's playstyle, the latest equipment for this build, along with useful gameplay tips and more. This build has a handful of ways to play, so if you want to get the most out of your Rellana's Twin Blade, this video is for you. The Moonblaze Samurai manipulates the power of the moon to deal multiple hitting range beams or shockwaves to take out targets or deal damage to bosses. Additionally, this build harnesses fire elemental powers and casts violent fire whirlwinds that engulf targets with continuous fire damage. But the majority of this build's damage comes from its quick multi-hitting attacks at close range. Being able to perform in any situations is the greatest feat of this build, while also equipped with fire-based incantations for more versatility. Build playstyle is out of the way. Moving on to the Moonblaze Samurai's stats. Note that I will be standardizing all of my builds around level 200, and it's up to you if you wish to level up this build past around this level. Before we move on, note that this build has so many variations in terms of stat spread, and it will determine your preference or playstyle later on. I'll be going through them and providing suggestions as well, but for now, here is my stat spread for my personal playstyle. Starting with Vigor first, and I allocated 50 points to Vigor since it is likely that the user will be getting hit while performing both of the weapon's unique animations. You can however adjust it to 60 points if you think you really need more health while adjusting to the build's gameplay. Plus, you will be up close to enemies most of the time since we will be capitalizing on its fast melee attacks, so there is a high chance that you will be trading blows with enemies. Next is Mind, and 30 points were allocated to it. You will be using a lot of focus on this build to ramp up the damage, so 30 points is suggested. Endurance is next, and I've allotted 30 points for Endurance. This build simply eats a lot of stamina while performing its greatest feats, and you can easily adjust this later on if you feel the need to do so. As mentioned, we will be capitalizing on Rellana's Twin Blade's fast melee attacks, so I have allotted 41 points to Strength and 36 points to Dexterity. Next is Intelligence, and note that the light skill attack of Rellana's Twin Blade primarily scales on Intelligence mostly. The higher your Intelligence, the more it will hit hard, so 41 points were allotted to it. Fate is another thing that you need to pay attention to, especially if you find yourself casting the fire stance of Rellana's Twin Blade frequently. It scales on Fate mostly, so be sure to take note on that. But since I went for the Jack of all trade route, I allotted 41 points to Fate. Lastly, we do not need Arcane in this build, so no points were allocated to it. Because of the nature of this build, or perhaps Rellana's Twin Blade is all over the place, I prepared different stat spread depending on your preferred playstyle. You will think that the Moon stance is the best pick for this build since it's cool and spamming those shockwaves may seem OP when you first glance at it. However, it has its issue as well, which we will be talking about later on. Now, the second playstyle is the Jack of all trade route, which I personally went for. In this route, the Moon and Fire stance is just a tool for you to be versatile in combat, not something that you will rely on in terms of dealing the bulk of the damage. The third spread specializes in making the Fire stance the main damage dealing move and making Fate its main stat. But of course, it has its issues as well, and this is the reason why I made the Jack of all trade stats spread. Stats are out of the way, let's move on to the Moonblaze Samurai's equipment. Starting with the build's main weapon, which is the mentioned Rellana's Twin Blades. This sword requires 13 strength, 16 dexterity, and 16 fate and intelligence to wield the weapon properly. You can see this weapon is all over the place, having C scaling for all of its key stats. We've already explained the possible stats route that you can take in this build, and I am hoping that this will not confuse you by now. Moving on to the weapon skill, which is the Moon and Fire stance. A highly versatile skill that allows the user to adapt to various situations in combat. Pressing L2 plus R1 will let you perform the Moon stance and give you the ability to perform series of shockwaves with a decent range. This is going to be one of your main range attacks or baiting tool in this build. One good thing about this skill is it makes small to mid-sized target flinch when getting hit by the shockwave. Successive R1 inputs will let you do shockwave follow-ups, dealing decent damage overall. On the other hand, while pressing L2 plus R2 will let the user perform the fire stance. The user will perform a spinning attack which then leads to a firestorm that leaves fire puddles on the ground, dealing damage over time to targets. a unique attack that is effective to both single and multiple targets, as this skill can deal great damage if used correctly. Moving on to the build's secondary weapon, and I am using the Giant Seal for us to access our key buffs for this build and boost our Giant Flames incantations later on. Weapons are out of the way, let's move on to spells. The first on the list is Flame Grant Me Strength incantation for an additional 20% physical attack boost and stamina recovery buff. The second buff on the list is of course Golden Vow. This buff increases overall damage by 15% and adds 10% damage negation, which is very helpful for this build. Moving on to my offensive incantations for this build, since the Moon stance range is somewhat limited, I decided to incorporate fire-based incantations that will not only match the theme, but also add versatility in combat. I slotted in Flame of the Fell God since I can easily cast it and slowly seek the targeted enemy while focusing on Rellana's Twin Blades repertoire. Also, note that when the firebolt explodes, it makes the enemy flinch or knock back small to mid-sized targets. Upon explosion, it will also leave fire residues on the ground that can also deal damage over time. What I usually do is cast this incantation, and when it hits the target and gets knocked back, I will then perform my killer combos while the enemy is down. The Giant Flame Take T will also be returning in this build, as you can knock down targets easily with this incantation, while also giving you more range attack choices. But before anything else, only 6% of you who watch the channel regularly are subscribed, so help the channel by subscribing today, and it's free anyway, and I will thank you forever. If you can hit that like button as well, it will surely help me a lot. Join our Discord server as we are building an empire where you can find like-minded people who love the same genre. Comment down below what build you want me to cover next, as more builds coming. Now back into the video. Spells are out of the way, moving on to my suggested talismans for this build. Now since this build is all over the place, talisman suggestions varies as well depending on what route you took. Of course, if you want more magic damage for your moon stance, equip magic increasing talismans, and the same thing applies to the fire stance. For the sake of the video, I will be flashing all of my suggested talismans for each setup on the screen right now. Pause the video if you need to. Now I will talk about the Jack of all trades setup, since this is the one that I focus on. The first talisman on the list is our staple Shard of Alexander. This provides a 15% skill damage increase, especially when performing both of the unique stances you have. Of course, since we are dealing with speedy multi-hitting attacks, and as usual, slotting in Millicent Prosthesis and the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia combo are optimal for this build. You will be activating the multi-hit attack buff always when performing the Rellana's Twin Blades dual stance combo without a hassle. Since all of your unique attacks have this long animation, you can easily replace Millicent Prosthesis with Dragon Crest Great Shield for the additional 20% physical damage negation. It will increase your overall survivability, especially when you are not used to the build's playstyle. The last talisman for this build is the mandatory two-headed turtle talisman. As mentioned previously, all of your movesets in this build eats a lot of stamina, and depleting your stamina is a regular thing if you are cranking out the damage per opening. Moving on to Great Runes, and of course, Godric's Great Rune is the suggested for the +5 stats across the board. These additional stats can give us more survivability and more damage. Now that the main equipment is out of the way, let's move on to the Moonblaze Samurai's armor set. I am wearing a Karya Knight armor piece, gauntlets, and greaves while returning the Land of Reed's helm to preserve the build's identity. I cannot stress how good looking this set is, as it matches the magic samurai looks that I am going for. Moving on to my Flash of Wonders physique combination, again, my suggestions vary depending on what setup you went for. I am showing each suggested physique combinations for all setup, so pause the video if you need to. Equipment and spells are out of the way, it's time for the build's pros and cons. Starting with pros first. The first advantage that I can think of is the build's versatility and dynamic gameplay. As mentioned, this build gives the ability the user to adapt in almost any situation. Do you need the range attack? Perform the moon stance. You need an AoE attack? Perform the fire stance. Are you a fan of flashy quick and melee attack combination? This build has you covered. If you chose the Jack of all trades setup, since you can adapt to any situation, the overall gameplay this build provides is pretty dynamic. It will give you this relentless warrior feel while juggling between your stance and melee attack combos, especially when dealing with bosses. The next pro that I can think of is that you do have a lot of setup routes that you can explore, especially when choosing the Moon and Fire stance in this case. Moon stance route will give you the ability to wield the best stabs in the game and perform the more powerful sorceries you prefer, while the Fire stance can even make your incantations even stronger, and you are more than welcome to slot in more powerful incantations to this build. Now moving on to cons. Since the Rellana's twin blade is trying to be everything, it ended up with low damage output. This is the price of versatility, and this mainly applies to the jack of all trades setup. This is also one of the reasons why I slotted Flame of the Fell God to compensate for the build's low damage output. Now you may be thinking, hey Samurai, my Moon and Fire stance hits a tons of damage, and I agree with you, especially if you optimize your setup around this special skill. But these skills have long wind-up time on the other hand. I find the super tight timing okay and fine for the most part. However, the majority of players, especially beginners, will have difficulties performing this skill over and over. Although in most cases, the Moon stance is much more forgiving because you can cancel its animation between follow-ups. However, there will be a lot of cases that you can only deal with one follow-up. Because of this, you will deal less damage and you will notice this easily. Aside from leading to poor damage even when using an optimized setup, not to mention that this build eats a lot of stamina when performing full combos. Overall, the Moonblaze Samurai is a decent build that offers great versatility and dynamic gameplay. I can say that it's not for me as I prefer focused and optimized types of build. But I can totally see that there are a lot of players who prefer the mentioned playstyle, and it all boils down to your personal preference at the end of the day. Comment down below which weapon would you like me to do next, and if you made it this far, I just want to say that I appreciate you. As always, give this video a like as it helps me a lot, and subscribe for more builds coming soon. Now if you want to shred enemies like butter or learn how to build the strongest build currently in Elden Ring, these build videos are for you. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.